So a few weeks ago, the cable on the Valve Index that I normally use for these videos unfortunately started having some issues. I'd been using it pretty heavily for about 6 months by then, which also included a bunch of public demos at events like PAX Australia, so honestly not too surprised that it broke. But while I've been waiting to get the new cable, I've been using this time to test out some different VR headsets, some that I haven't used for a while, some that I'm using for the first time. So, when the cable first broke, I did a video comparing the Index to the original Vive, because both headsets I've used pretty extensively. So I did a video covering like, if the upgrade from the Vive to the Index was actually worth it for competitive first-person shooters. Not too long after that, I also bought myself a Rift S, mainly for public demos, because it's a lot easier to use that for public demos than a lighthouse tracking system. But I also really wanted to put it through its paces in Pavlov as well, because I've always had pretty mixed feelings about the Rift S. I've been a bit wary about some of the changes they made for it, which we'll get into in a bit, but I've spent the last few weeks using it as my main VR headset, and I've finally got some impressions about how well I think it works for competitive VR FPSs. So when the Rift S was first announced, almost a year ago now, I was not a big fan. Some of the specs in that headset were a bit of a downgrade from the original Rift, and the three main sticking points for me were the switch from an OLED to an LCD panel, because LCDs don't have as good colors as OLEDs, the reduction in frame rate from 90 frames to 80 frames, and the big one for me was them going from an external tracking system, where it had those little webcams that would sit on your desk, to an inside-out tracking system. Because up until then, my early experiences with inside-out tracking was Windows Mixed Reality, which, while it worked better than I expected, also didn't work quite as well once I started getting more competitive with these kinds of games. So those are three things that I expected to not like about the Rift S when I first booted it up. However, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag than that. Some of those things I did end up liking, I didn't think they were that big of an issue. And then there's some other issues I totally wasn't expecting to have, but we'll get into what I like about this headset first. Always good to start off with the pros. So that change from OLED to LCD, I wasn't expecting that to be very good. Now, I think I mentioned this in my Index versus Vive video, because they did the same thing. Vive was an OLED, Index was an LCD, and it's really noticeable. The Index's LCD does not do black levels well at all. Anytime you're in a dark scene, it's all sort of like a muddy grey. However, I'm not finding this anywhere near as bad on the Rift S. The Rift S has actually got a really nice screen. I mean, the blacks aren't quite as black as the Vive, or even the original Rift. However, they're nowhere near as washed out as the Index. So it feels like a nice middle ground between the two. Colors seem to be pretty good as well. Resolution obviously is pretty good. It feels right now that resolution is pretty comparable between all the main new headsets. The Cosmos, the Rift S, the Valve Index, the Vive Pro even. I don't think you're going to notice too much of a difference in resolution between all of those. They're all pretty solid. I know one of the other issues with the Rift S is the fixed IPD. There's no IPD adjustment. However, that wasn't a problem for me because my IPD pretty much is what the fixed IPD in the headset is. So I haven't really tried out the software adjustment because I haven't really needed to. The field of view on the headset is pretty nice as well. It's supposed to be 115 degrees. However, with VR headset field of views, it's a bit tricky to get an exact amount because it'll always change depending on what kind of head shape you have, how it actually sits on your face. Obviously, the closer it is to your face, the wider the field of view is going to be. So when I first got the Rift S, I thought it was a little bit low. But that's because I wasn't putting the headset on properly. I was putting the headset on by putting the headband on first and tightening in that, and then sliding the headset backwards and forwards to what felt like the right place. However, that's the wrong way to do it. You want to take your headset and you want to slide the front part so it's as close in as possible, and then you put the headband on. That'll make sure you get the highest field of view out of the headset you can. And it's a pretty noticeable bump in field of view. Compared to the original Rift and the original Vive, it may be only about 5 to 10 degrees more field of view, but it is pretty noticeable. I think I mentioned that in my Vive video. It did kind of feel like I was wearing binoculars and that after going from the Index to the Vive. However, it's not quite as bad in the Rift S. I do have a bit more peripheral vision to work with. There's just one little thing, it's not a deal breaker, but it's something that's always annoyed me about the Rift, and I'm a little bit disappointed to see it there in the Rift S. And again, this is probably just something because of my head shape, but I can always see the very edge of the screen they use on the left side. I can always see just like a straight line, it's like a rectangular block just ending where the screen ends. It was like that with the Rift for me, it's like that for the Rift S. I don't know why I can't see it on the right side, it's only on the left side. Again, it's probably just my head shape being weird. It's by no means a deal breaker, it's just weird and a little bit irksome. Last thing to cover on the screen is the refresh rate. Now, original Rift and the original Vive were both 90 frames per second, or 90 hertz, I mean. The Valve Index is by default 120 hertz, but can go up to 144 hertz. And the Rift S was a downgrade, and it's at 80 hertz. Now, using the Valve Index kind of has ruined refresh rates in headsets for me, because the 80 hertz it's a little bit more, but it's almost about half of the Valve Index's refresh rate. And it's pretty insanely noticeable to me. It was noticeable on the Vive as well, but I know 10 frames per second doesn't really feel like too much, but it does seem to make a pretty big difference once you're playing something really fast-paced like this. Where this drop in frame rate affects things the most is when aiming. Whenever I'm trying to make little tiny movements to adjust, being almost half the frame rate, I've got almost half the info to work with. And it feels really noticeable. It feels like my aim is a lot worse on the Rift S than it is on the Index. This is something that applies to competitive FPSs outside of VR as well. You ask any competitive FPS player, a 60Hz monitor versus a 144Hz monitor, you're always going to want the 144 because you can just see so much more. You can make those little fine adjustments, you can react to things marginally quicker. If you're on a screen with a lower refresh rate, you're just going to do worse. So yeah, for a competitive FPS, you're always going to want more frames per second. Right now, the Index is the only headset that goes over 100. The 90 on the Vive was already feeling pretty low. Dropping that down to 80 on the Rift S just feels worse. I'm not a fan. It almost made me want to rage quit and not play the game. That's everything for the headset. Let's talk about the controllers now, because that's what I was most curious about, was how well the controller tracking was going to work. I wasn't too concerned about the headset tracking. That was never an issue on Windows Mixed Reality with 2 cameras. Rift S having 5 cameras, I expected that to work fine. The controller tracking, on the other hand, was a little bit rough at launch. I remember trying a launch Rift S, and while I didn't actually get to try any FPSs on them, I did put my hands where I would hold them for an FPS, and I was losing tracking on the right hand, which normally sits around where my shoulder is. So I was pretty concerned about that. However, they seem to have done some pretty solid updates software-wise, and I'm gonna be honest, I haven't seen any tracking issues at all. Nothing that's affected my aim. I've actually been pretty impressed with what they've been able to do with the inside-out tracking on this headset. Now, obviously there are still dead zones on this headset, but I haven't found any where my hands actually are when I'm playing these kinds of games. It all just works. I'm actually insanely impressed. So yeah, I was pretty happy to see that. That was my main concern with the Rift S. And no, it's not an issue. Tracking just seems to work fine. The button layout and the ergonomics are pretty solid as well. It's probably the most comfortable VR controller out there, out of the Rift controllers, the Vive ones, and the Index controllers. I will say it is a little bit on the tiny side. It does feel like a little bit hard to hold onto for my hands. It feels like the actual controller length is slightly too short, but again, that's going to come down to the size of your hands. The Valve Index on the other side does seem to be designed for bigger hands, so smaller hands might do better with the Rift S, and not as well with the Index controllers, but bigger hands might do better with the Index controllers, and not so well with the Rift S controllers. Button layout's pretty good as well. It is a little bit of a downside not having as many inputs as the Index, because I do like to remap things, especially having the eject mag button mapped to squeezing the Index controller. I am missing that, however, I did adjust to pressing the B button to eject mags pretty easily. And one major pro for the Rift S controllers is that it's nice to have a thumbstick that works. Yeah, the thumbsticks have been a bit of an issue on the Index controllers, but the thumbsticks on the Rift S, they feel pretty nice. They just work. They feel way better than the Index's thumbsticks. I really hope the Index can get the quality of its thumbsticks up to the Rift S because, yeah, they're my favorite out of all the VR controllers so far. The triggers, however, I am really not a fan of the triggers on this controller. I was not expecting to not like these triggers, but it's probably my least favorite thing about this entire Rift S. And the triggers don't seem to be anywhere near as sensitive, and they just feel weird compared to the Index's triggers. So this is my main issue that I've been having. When I play on the Index, I always play around the Steam VR bindings, and I always set myself up a hair trigger. Now, I've got a video talking about settings for Pavlov VR where I cover this, but what I do is I change the sensitivity of the triggers, like how far I have to push in the triggers for it to register a press. Now normally this ends up being 10% pressed to register the click, and then 5% pressed to register, well, to stop registering the click. Which means that I can just like tap the trigger really quickly. It's very responsive, it's very quick. However, on the Rift S controllers, I can't do this. If I set it up exactly the same, what ends up happening is that it doesn't always register when I've stopped pressing my triggers. So if I try to spam it really quickly, it ends up missing certain clicks, and I just can't click it anywhere near as fast as the Index. So for the Rift S, I actually had to end up setting this to 50% pressed for it to register a click, which is way less sensitive than the Index. I haven't exactly figured out why the triggers are like this. I do have a few ideas. First being that the triggers on the Rift S don't feel anywhere near as springy as the Indexes. They actually feel a little bit mushy. So maybe they're not springing back as well as the Indexes when I actually let go. So I'm not actually fully releasing the triggers before I go to click again. That could be what the issue is. The other thing is that it feels like the triggers have a lot more travel distance than the Index's triggers. The Index triggers, much like the Vive triggers, actually have kind of like a two-stage click. You can click down to about, I think it's about 80%-ish. And there's a hard stop on the triggers. You click it further and it feels like a mouse button to get the full 100%. It's kind of weird to describe, but I've always liked that about both the Vive and the Index. So combine that with the stiffer springs, it feels as though the Index controllers can handle going from like pressed to unpressed and doing really fast taps a lot better than the Rift S. So no matter what settings I set the Rift S to try and compensate for this, I just can't get it to work in a way that I can spam fire as quickly as I do on the Index. And this is really important when I'm playing with semi-automatic guns, like the AK, because I always use the AK on semi-auto instead of full auto. Same with pistols, they're all pretty much semi-auto. I just can't shoot as quickly and as rapidly as I can on the Valve Index. Maybe a part of this is that I just need to get used to the Rift S's triggers. I don't know, I've been using it for a few weeks now. I just can't get the hang of it, especially going from the Index. The Rift S's triggers just feel really weird to me, and I really wasn't expecting them to be an issue. Combine that with the lower refresh rate, I just can't shoot as fast. I can't see and react as quickly. It really frustrates me. It really is really frustrating going from an Index to a Rift S. Like, don't get me wrong, this is still a really nice headset. If you're new to VR, it's a solid headset. I actually would recommend this headset if you wanted to get into VR FPSs and you don't want to spend the amount of money it costs to get an Index. The Rift S is a really good place to start. However, if you do want to start playing these games competitively, it really does feel like the improvements to the Index make a huge difference to how well you can play. Just the triggers alone make me want to go back to my Vive, because I can use my Index controllers with my Vive while I wait for my replacement cable. Even though the resolution on that has been driving me crazy, the frame rate and the triggers, I actually prefer using my original Vive over the Rift S. I'm not disappointed in my Rift S. It's going to work perfectly for what I bought it for, which is for public demos. But it's not my headset of choice when it comes to competitiveness. But that's pretty much all I have to say about the headset for now. I'm going to keep using it. I'm going to keep playing around with the triggers, see if I can get something better going with them. I'll let you know how that goes. Actually, one last thing that I forgot to mention was the cable length. Now, this isn't really too big of an issue because it's easy to extend your cable length. Just get some USB extenders, some, DisplayPort extenders, and you're fine. But the default length of the Rift S is pretty short. It's a lot harder for me to move around as much as I would with the Index or the Vive. So if you're going to get a Rift S, keep that in mind. it's probably worthwhile buying some cable extenders. Well, that's pretty much everything. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, hope you found it informative. If you use the Rift S yourself, I'd love to hear your impressions for these kinds of FPSs. Let me know what you think of the headset down below, and I will see you all in the next one.